You're too old to travel, my son said, setting his fork down like he had just stated something obvious, something final, something I was supposed to accept without question. I didn't respond right away. I simply looked at him, really looked at the man I had raised, the boy who once begged me to take him to the ocean because he wanted to see how far the world went. Now he sat across from me in a perfectly pressed shirt, in a house I had helped him afford, telling me my world should be smaller. Olivia, his wife, smiled faintly beside him, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. It's just not safe at your age, she added, her tone soft, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced saying it in a mirror. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. My hands were steady. They always were. I see, I said, my voice calm, almost distant, as if I were commenting on the weather. Inside something shifted, not broken, not shattered, just clarified. The room felt quieter after that. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder, counting something down that only I could hear. Daniel leaned back in his chair, satisfied, as if he had just handled a responsibility, checked off a box labeled "Take care of Mom." He didn't notice that I wasn't arguing. He didn't notice that I wasn't asking questions. He didn't notice that I had already made a decision hours before this dinner ever began. That morning, while the sun was still low and the streets were quiet, I had been sitting in a leather chair across from Mr. Harrison Cole, a man who had known me long before Daniel ever signed his first lease. "Are you certain?" he had asked, sliding the documents across the desk. His voice was careful, respectful, not like the way people speak to someone they think is fragile. "Very," I had replied, picking up the pen without hesitation. The ink flowed smoothly as I signed my name, each letter deliberate, final. Margaret Whitmore. I remember thinking how steady my handwriting still was. No tremor. No doubt. Just clarity. Back at the dinner table, Olivia was talking about a neighbor's trip to Arizona. Something about warm weather and golf resorts, places more suitable. I nodded once politely as if I were listening, but mine was somewhere else entirely. I was thinking about the itinerary I had reviewed that morning. 12 countries. 4 continents. 187 days at sea. I was thinking about the way the agent had smiled when I told her I wanted the balcony suite. "You'll have the best view on the ship," she said. I had smiled back. "I intend to." Daniel cleared his throat. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," he said, softer now, like he was offering comfort after delivering a verdict. I looked at him again, this time with something close to curiosity. When had he started believing that control was the same as care? When had he decided that my life needed to be reduced to something manageable, something convenient for him? I stood up slowly, smoothing my skirt, the fabric falling neatly into place. "Of course you do," I said. And I meant it. People always believe they're doing the right thing even when they're not. Olivia watched me closely as I walked toward the kitchen, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if she sensed something she couldn't quite name. Good instincts, I thought. Too late. I rinsed my plate under warm water, listening to their voices behind me, already shifting to another topic, already moving on. That was the moment I understood it completely. I was no longer part of their plans. I was something to be managed, adjusted, quietly set aside. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, the soft cotton towel absorbing the last traces of water. Tomorrow I would confirm the final transfer. The apartment, the one I had paid for, the one Daniel believed was his, would no longer belong to him. Not legally. Not in any way that mattered. I walked back into the dining room and picked up my purse. Daniel glanced up. "Leaving already?" he asked. I met his eyes, and for the first time that evening, I let a small smile form. Not warm. Not cold. Just certain. "I have an early morning," I said. And I did. There was a car scheduled to take me to the port. There was a ship waiting. And there was an entire world I was about to see, whether he thought I was too old or not. I woke before sunrise, the kind of quiet hour that used to belong to routine but now felt like something else entirely, something deliberate. The house was still, the air cool, and for a moment I stood in the hallway just listening, not for sound but for absence. No footsteps. No voices. No one asking where I was going or why. I moved through the kitchen slowly, making coffee the same way I had for years, measuring the grounds, pouring the water, waiting for the familiar drip. Tasted the same. Everything did. but it no longer felt the same. I carried the mug to the window and looked out at the street, at the row of identical houses, at the trimmed lawns and parked cars, at the life I had lived inside for so long. Contained. Predictable. Manageable. That was the word Olivia liked. Manageable. I took a sip and set the mug down untouched after that. There were things to do. I dressed carefully, not out of habit but out of intention, choosing a navy coat that fit well and shoes that were comfortable for walking, the kind of details that used to go unnoticed but now felt like small declarations. When I stepped outside, the morning air was crisp, just under 60 degrees, and the sky carried that pale light that comes before the sun fully rises. The car arrived exactly on time. It always does when you arrange it yourself. The driver stepped out, polite, efficient, asking only for my name. Margaret Whitmore, I said, and hearing it out loud felt different today, like it belonged entirely to me again. The ride was quiet. I watched the city wake up in fragments, a bakery opening its doors, a man jogging along the sidewalk, a woman walking her dog, each of them moving through their own lives without interference. I wondered, not for the first time, when I had stopped doing the same. The bank was already open when I arrived. Mr. Cole was waiting, just as he had said he would be. He greeted me with a nod, not overly warm, not distant, just respectful. "Everything is ready," he said, guiding me into his office. The documents were laid out neatly on the desk, each page marked, each line clear. I read through them again, not because I doubted anything, but because I wanted to see it, to understand the full shape of what I was doing. The apartment. The one Daniel believed was his foundation, his security, his proof that he had built something of his own. I remembered the day we first walked through it together. The way he had looked around with excitement, the way he had said, "I could really make a life here." I had smiled and said, "You will." What I had not said was how much of that life had been quietly supported by me. Mr. Cole cleared his throat gently. "You understand that once this is finalized, there is no reversal without consent from the new owner," he said. I met his eyes. "I understand," I replied. And I did. Completely. The pen felt solid in my hand. I signed where he indicated, each motion steady, each page another step forward. When it was done, he gathered the papers and placed them into a folder with careful precision. "The funds will be transferred by this afternoon," he said. I nodded once. No excitement. No hesitation. Just confirmation. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting a warmer light across the street. I checked my watch. There was still time before the car would take me to the port. I decided to walk. It was not far, just under a mile, and the movement felt right, like I was physically stepping into something new. As I walked, I passed storefronts, people, conversations I was not part of, and for the first time in a long while, that did not feel like exclusion. Felt like freedom. My phone buzzed once in my purse. I did not take it out. Not yet. There would be time for that. Ahead, I could see the outline of the harbor, the faint shape of the ship rising above the buildings, larger than I had imagined, steady, waiting. I slowed my pace slightly, not out of doubt, but to take it in. Every step brought me closer to something Daniel had decided I was no longer allowed to have. And every step proved him wrong. I reached the terminal just as the morning light settled fully across the harbor, turning the water a soft shade of silver, calm but endless, like it was inviting rather than intimidating. And for a moment I stood there with my suitcase beside me, not moving, not hesitating, simply observing, taking in the scale of it all. The ship rising several decks high, its white exterior clean and deliberate, a structure built for movement, for distance, for escape, and I realized something then, something quiet but undeniable, that this was the first decision in a long time that belonged entirely to me. No approval required, no explanation necessary, just a choice made and carried through to its conclusion, and that realization settled into me more firmly than any fear ever could. I adjusted my grip on the handle of my suitcase and began to walk forward. Each step measured, steady, the wheels rolling smoothly across the pavement, the sound soft but consistent, like a metronome marking the pace of a life that was finally moving again. Inside the terminal the air was warmer, filled with the low hum of voices, announcements echoing gently overhead, people lining up, checking documents, preparing to leave one place for another, and I joined them without urgency, without impatience, simply present. When it was my turn, the attendant smiled and asked for my passport, her tone Professional but kind, I handed it over and watched as she typed, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "First time with us, Ms. Whitmore?" she asked, glancing up briefly. "Yes," I said, and it felt like more than an answer, it felt like a statement. She returned the passport and handed me a boarding card. "You are going to love it," she said, and I nodded, not because I needed reassurance, but because I recognized the sincerity in her voice. Beyond the check-in desk, the space opened up toward the boarding area, large windows framing the ship in full view now, and I paused again just for a second, allowing myself to take in the magnitude of what I was stepping into. Not just the journey, but the decision behind it. My phone buzzed again, this time more insistently, and I knew without looking who it would be. Daniel was not a patient man when something disrupted his expectations. I let it buzz once more before reaching into my purse and pulling it out. The screen lit up, with his name, missed calls stacking, messages appearing one after another. I opened the most recent one. "Mom, call me now." Short. Direct. Not a question, not concern, just instruction. I stared at it for a moment, not with anger, not even with disappointment, just observation, the same pattern, the same assumption that I would respond immediately, that I would explain myself, that I would adjust. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my purse without replying. Not out of defiance, but out of clarity. There was nothing left to explain. A final boarding call echoed through the terminal, calm and measured, inviting passengers to proceed, and I stepped forward with the others, moving down the corridor that connected land to ship, the transition subtle but significant, the floor beneath my feet shifting slightly as I crossed over, a reminder that I was leaving something fixed and stepping into something that moved. The air changed too, carrying a faint scent of salt and distance, and when I finally stepped onto the deck, I paused once more, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to mark the moment. Below me the water stretched out in every direction, open, uncontained, and I felt something settle inside me, not excitement, not relief, but something quieter, something stronger, ownership. I had not been pushed into this, I had not been guided or persuaded, I had chosen it, completely, fully, and behind me, somewhere far enough away to no longer matter, was a life that had tried to become smaller without my permission. I did not look back, there was nothing there that needed my attention anymore, only what was ahead, and for the first time in a long while that was more than enough. The first day at sea began without announcement, without ceremony, just a subtle shift in motion that I felt before I saw. The floor beneath my feet no longer perfectly still, the horizon outside my balcony stretching wider than any street I had walked in years, and I stood there with my hands resting lightly on the railing, watching the shoreline fade into something distant and indistinct, not disappearing entirely, just becoming irrelevant, the way certain memories do when they are no longer needed to define you. The air was cooler out here, touched with salt and something clean, something that did not belong to any house or expectation, and I took a slow breath, not to calm myself, but to register it, to remember what it felt like to stand somewhere without being measured, without being advised, without being told what was appropriate for my age. My phone buzzed again inside my room, a persistent vibration that echoed faintly through the open door, and I already knew the rhythm of it. Daniel had never been subtle when something did not go according to his plan. I turned away from the railing and walked back inside. The room was exactly as it had been described, spacious enough, well arranged, the bed neatly made, a small sitting area by the window, everything intentional, nothing excessive. I picked up my phone and looked at the screen, 12 missed calls, 5 voicemails, and a series of messages that had grown longer with each attempt, the first still controlled. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk." The next sharper. "I just got a notice about the apartment, call me immediately." And then the shift, the unraveling. "What did you do?" I read them all without reacting, without rushing, simply taking them in as information, not accusation, not guilt, just confirmation that the sequence had unfolded exactly as expected. I set the phone down on the small table beside the bed and sat for a moment, my hands resting in my lap, steady, unchanged. The silence in the room was complete, not the kind of silence that follows tension, but the kind that exists on its own, unbothered. I stood again and walked to the closet, opening it to reveal the clothes I had packed, simple, practical, enough for months, not chosen to impress anyone, not chosen to fit into any expectation, just chosen because I wanted them. And that realization lingered longer than I expected. How long it had been since I had made a decision without considering how it would be received, how it would be interpreted, how it would affect someone else's comfort. I closed the closet and returned to the balcony, the ship cutting through the water now with quiet consistency, no abrupt movement, no resistance, just forward motion, and I leaned slightly against the railing, watching the waves part and reform behind us, leaving no permanent trace, just a temporary disruption that smoothed itself out over time. I thought about the apartment then, not with attachment, not even with regret, just with clarity. I remembered the paperwork, the transfer, the numbers aligning in a way that made sense, not emotionally but logically, the structure of ownership. The reality of who had contributed, who had decided, who had assumed. Daniel had always believed that time turned support into entitlement, that enough years of living somewhere made it his by default, but time does not rewrite contracts, it only reveals how they were understood. I checked my watch, the time difference already beginning to separate me from the schedule I had once followed, meals, calls, routines that no longer applied, and for a brief moment I considered returning one of his calls, not to explain but to close something, to provide a final statement that would settle whatever questions remained, but I dismissed the thought just as quickly as it appeared. There was nothing left to settle, everything had already been decided, the paperwork was complete, the transfer confirmed, the distance established. Explanation would not change that, it would only invite negotiation, and I was no longer interested in negotiating my own life. A voice over the intercom announced the first gathering in the main lounge, a welcome reception for passengers, light music, introductions, a structured beginning for those who needed one. I listened for a moment, then turned away, not because I would not attend, but because I did not need to follow the sequence immediately. I could choose when to arrive, how long to stay, whether to engage at all, and that choice, simple as it was, felt more significant than anything Daniel had tried to take from me. I reached for my phone once more, not to answer, but to silence it, holding the power button until the screen went dark. The vibration stopped, the connection paused, and I placed it back on the table, out of reach, not as a rejection but as a decision. Outside, the ocean stretched without boundary, the ship moving forward without hesitation. And I remained exactly where I was, not lost, not waiting, just present, fully, completely, and for the first time in years that was enough. By the second morning, the rhythm of the ship had settled into something steady, almost predictable, a quiet forward motion that did not ask for permission and did not wait for anyone to catch up. And I found myself waking before the sun again, not out of habit this time, but because I wanted to, because there was something about watching the horizon shift from darkness to light that felt earned rather than routine. I stepped onto the balcony with a light sweater wrapped around my shoulders, the air cooler than the day before, somewhere in the mid-50s, and I rested my hands on the railing, looking out at nothing and everything at once. The ocean did not offer details, it offered space, and that space allowed thoughts to rise without interruption, without someone else stepping in to reshape them. My phone remained off inside, untouched since the night before, and I did not feel the absence of it as loss, only as quiet, a quiet that had become unfamiliar over the years without me realizing it. Later that morning I made my way to the main dining room, not because I needed to follow a schedule, but because I was curious. The room was large, filled with soft conversation, silverware, the low hum of people beginning something new at the same time. I was seated at a table near the window, across from a woman about my age with short gray hair and a posture that suggested she had spent her life standing her ground. She introduced herself as Eleanor Brooks, her voice direct, her handshake firm. "First time?" she asked, glancing at the ocean behind me. "Yes," I said again, and this time the word came easier. She nodded once, as if that explained everything. "Took me 72 years to get here," she said, not with regret, just as a fact. "My husband always said we would go one day, but there was always something else that needed doing first." I listened without interrupting, recognizing the pattern, the way life rearranges itself around responsibilities until the original intention becomes distant, almost optional. "And now?" I asked, not out of politeness but because I wanted to understand how someone else had arrived here. She smiled slightly, a small shift at the corner of her mouth. "Now there is nothing left that needs to be done before this," she said, and the simplicity of it stayed with me longer than I expected. We ate in comfortable silence after that, not the kind that fills space but the kind that allows it, and when I finished, I took my time leaving, walking through the corridors, noticing details I had not seen before, the way the light reflected off the polished surfaces, the way people moved with a mix of curiosity and caution, all of us adjusting to a place that did not belong to our previous routines. In the afternoon I returned to my room and turned my phone back on, not because I felt compelled to respond, but because I wanted to see the shape of what I had left behind. The screen lit up immediately, messages flooding in, missed calls stacking higher than before, Daniel's name repeated again and again. But now there were others. Olivia, a number I recognized as the building manager, Even a short message from Mr. Cole confirming that the funds had been successfully transferred. I read through them slowly, one by one. The tone had changed. The certainty replaced by confusion, then frustration, then something closer to urgency. "Mom, we need to fix this." One message read as if this were an error, a mistake that could be corrected if addressed quickly enough. Another followed sharper. "You had no right to do that." And I paused there for a moment, not because the words carried weight, but because of what they revealed, the assumption that rights had shifted without acknowledgement, that what had always been mine had somehow become his through time alone. I placed the phone back down without responding, the decision already made, already carried out, no longer open to interpretation outside. The ocean remained unchanged, steady, indifferent to the messages waiting on a small screen inside my room. I stepped back onto the balcony, the sun lower now, casting longer reflections across the water, and I realized that the distance between where I was and where they were had already grown beyond what any conversation could bridge, not because of miles but because of understanding. They were still trying to adjust the situation to fit their expectations, and I had already stepped into something that no longer required theirs. I leaned slightly against the railing again, the movement familiar now, natural, and for the first time I did not think about what came next in terms of reaction, response, or consequence. I thought about it in terms of choice, what I would do, where I would go, how long I would stay. And that shift, quiet as it was, felt more permanent than any document I had signed. The ship moved forward without hesitation, and so did I. On the third evening, the ocean changed color before the sky did, shifting from a clear blue to something deeper, heavier, like it was holding more than it showed on the surface, and I stood at the railing longer than usual, watching the way the light stretched across the water in long, quiet lines, the kind that do not rush, do not demand attention, but remain until you notice them, and I realized I had begun to measure time differently here, not by hours or schedules, but by moments that stayed with me, the way the air felt, the way the ship moved, the way silence no longer felt empty. My phone remained inside, powered on now but no longer in my hand, no longer something I checked out of reflex, and when I finally returned to my room, I saw the notifications waiting, fewer than before, but heavier in tone, as if the urgency had settled into something more calculated. I sat down in the chair by the window and picked it up, scrolling slowly, not searching for anything specific, just observing the shift. Daniel's messages had changed again, no longer demanding immediate answers, now asking questions that tried to sound reasonable. "Mom, can we talk this through?" One read, followed by, "There has to be a misunderstanding," and then another, quieter, almost careful, "I just want to understand why you did this." I paused on that one, not because it moved me, but because it revealed something he had not intended. He still believed this was about explanation, about emotion, about something that could be clarified if only I would speak. He had not yet understood that this was about structure, about decisions made long before he noticed, about a boundary that had already been drawn and would not be erased by conversation. There was a message from Olivia as well, shorter, more precise. "This is not what your son deserves." And I read it twice, not because it was unclear, but because it was so direct in its assumption, the quiet belief that deserving was something that could be claimed without question, without reflection. I set the phone down again, the screen going dark as the room settled back into its quiet. Outside, the last of the sunlight faded, leaving the water darker, almost indistinguishable from the sky, and I leaned back in the chair, letting the stillness remain, not filling it, not interrupting it, just allowing it to exist. I thought about the years before this, not in detail, not in a sequence of events, but in patterns, the way decisions had gradually shifted away from me, small at first, suggestions framed as care, guidance presented as concern. "You should not drive that far. It might be better if we handled that for you." Each one reasonable on its own, each one easy to accept, until they formed something larger, something that quietly replaced my own authority without ever stating it directly, and I had accepted it, not because I believed I needed it, but because it seemed easier, smoother, less confrontational, until the day it was no longer a suggestion but a statement, not a concern but a conclusion, and that was the moment everything became clear, not emotionally but structurally. I stood and walked back out onto the balcony, the air warmer now, the wind softer, the ship continuing forward without hesitation, and I rested my hands on the railing again, the metal cool beneath my palms, steady, unchanging. I did not feel anger, not even now, not even after the messages. What I felt was something quieter, something more resolved, a recognition that what had happened was not sudden, not unexpected, just finally visible, the end result of a pattern that had been building for years. And now that I could see it fully, I could not return to it, not because I was unwilling, but because it no longer fit, the space it required no longer existed in the same way. My phone buzzed once more behind me, a single vibration softer this time, and I did not turn to look at it. I did not need to. Whatever was waiting there belonged to a version of my life that had already shifted, already moved out of reach. I stayed where I was, looking out at the horizon where the line between water and sky had almost disappeared, and I realized that this was what distance actually felt like, not separation filled with tension, but separation without pull, without the need to return, just space, open and uninterrupted. And for the first time I did not measure it in miles, but in understanding, in the quiet certainty that I had already gone further than they could follow. The fourth morning did not feel new in the same way the first had, but it felt settled, like I had crossed an invisible line somewhere between hesitation and certainty, and there was no longer any need to look back to confirm that it had happened. I woke later this time, the sunlight already filling the room in a way that made the walls seem brighter than they were, and for a moment I stayed where I was, not because I was tired, but because I was not being pulled in any direction. There was no schedule waiting for me, no expectation pressing against the edges of the day, just space, and I let myself remain in it a little longer before getting up, moving slowly, deliberately, not out of caution but out of choice. When I finally reached for my phone, it felt lighter than it had before, not physically, but in what it represented. I turned the screen on and saw fewer messages this time. The urgency had shifted again, no longer sharp, no longer insistent, but something quieter, more strategic. Daniel's name appeared at the top, followed by a message that was longer than the others, more composed. Mom, I have spoken to a lawyer. This situation is not as simple as you think. We need to resolve this properly. I read it once, then again, not because it required clarification, but because of the tone, the shift from confusion to control, from reaction to attempt at authority, and I recognized it immediately. It was not new, it was the same pattern, just expressed more formally. Olivia's influence was clear in it, the language precise, measured, designed to reposition the situation as something negotiable, something that could be corrected if handled properly. I set the phone down without replying, not because I was avoiding it, but because there was nothing there that required my participation. The situation had already been resolved, not improperly, not emotionally, but legally, completely, and I knew that Mr. Cole would have anticipated this, would have structured everything in a way that did not leave openings for reinterpretation. I dressed and made my way to the upper deck, the air warmer now, closer to 70 degrees, the sun steady above the horizon, and I walked along the edge of the ship, the movement familiar now, my steps aligning with the subtle rhythm beneath me. There were fewer people here at this hour, just a handful of others moving quietly through their own routines, and I found a chair near the railing, sitting down and letting the warmth settle over me, not thinking about what I had left behind, not revisiting the messages, just allowing the present moment to remain uninterrupted. After a while Eleanor joined me, her steps confident, her posture unchanged. She sat beside me without asking, as if we had already established that permission was not necessary between us. You look different today, she said, not as a question, just an observation. I considered that for a moment, not searching for an answer, just acknowledging it. I feel different, I said, and that was enough. She nodded once, looking out at the water. It happens when you stop waiting for someone else to decide what your life should look like, she said, her voice steady, and I recognized the truth in it immediately, not because it was new, but because it had already begun to take shape in me. We sat in silence after that, not needing to fill the space with anything more, and when I eventually stood to leave, I did so without hesitation, without the small pause that used to come before transitions, the one that checked for approval, for confirmation. It was gone now, replaced by something quieter, something more complete. Back in my room, the phone remained where I had left it, the screen dark, the messages still waiting, and I picked it up once more, not to respond, but to read the final message that had arrived while I was outside. This one, shorter, sharper, stripped of the careful tone from before. You are making a mistake, it read, and I looked at it for a long moment, not because it unsettled me, but because it clarified something even further, the belief that my decisions required correction, that my actions needed to be aligned with his expectations, that my life, even now, was still subject to his interpretation. I turned the phone off again, holding the button until the screen faded completely, and set it aside, not with force, not with finality, just with intention. Outside, the ocean continued without interruption, the horizon unchanged, the ship moving forward with the same steady rhythm it had maintained since the beginning, and I stood at the window watching it, not as something I was escaping to, but as something I had chosen, fully, completely, without hesitation, and that choice, quiet as it was, felt more permanent than anything he could argue against. By the 5th day, the distance was no longer something I measured at all, not in miles, not in time zones, not even in the number of messages I had chosen not to answer. It had settled into something else entirely, something internal, something that did not shift no matter how far the ship carried me. I had stopped expecting my phone to light up, stopped anticipating the next attempt to reach me, and when I finally turned it on again that afternoon, it was not out of curiosity, but out of completeness, as if I were closing a chapter one had already finished reading. The screen came alive slowly, notifications appearing in a delayed sequence, and I watched them without urgency. Daniel's name still there. But now the messages were different again, no longer controlled, no longer strategic, something more exposed, more direct. Mom, this is getting out of hand. One read, followed by another. You cannot just disappear and take everything with you. And I paused there, not because the words carried weight, but because of what they revealed, the assumption that what I had done was sudden, impulsive, something driven by emotion rather than decision. I scrolled further, another message appeared, shorter this time, almost uncertain. Why did you not tell me? And I considered that question for a moment, not because I owed it an answer, but because it reflected something deeper, the belief that my decisions required his awareness in order to be valid, that without his involvement they were incomplete. I locked the phone and set it aside again, the need to respond no longer present, not suppressed, just absent. Later that evening I walked along the deck as the sun lowered behind the horizon, the air warm, the movement of the ship steady beneath my feet, and I found myself thinking about the moment everything had shifted, not at the dinner table, not when the words were spoken, but before that, earlier, quieter, when I had sat in that office and signed my name without hesitation. That had been the moment, not loud, not dramatic, but final. Everything after that had simply followed, a sequence unfolding exactly as it had been set in motion. I stopped near the railing and looked out at the water, the surface darker now, reflecting only the last traces of light, and I realized that what Daniel was reacting to was not the action itself, not the sail, not the departure, but the loss of control over something he had come to assume was already his, and that assumption had never been challenged until now, not because it was correct, but because it had been convenient. I leaned slightly forward, resting my hands on the railing, the metal warm from the day's heat, and I allowed that realization to settle without resistance, without judgment, just understanding. Behind me, voices drifted from the lounge, soft music, quiet conversation, life continuing in parallel, unaffected by the messages waiting on a small device inside my room, and I stayed where I was for a while longer, not thinking about what I would say if I ever chose to respond, not rehearsing explanations, not preparing defenses, because there was nothing left to defend. The decisions had been made clearly, legally, completely, and the consequences, whatever they were, belonged to those decisions as naturally as the movement of the ship belonged to the ocean. When I finally returned to my room, I picked up the phone once more, not to read but to act. I opened a single message thread, Daniel's, and for the first time since I had left, I typed, not quickly, not emotionally, but with the same steadiness I had used when signing my name days before, each word deliberate, each sentence complete. I did not disappear. I wrote, pausing briefly before continuing. I chose where to go. I stopped there, reading it once, not for correction but for clarity, and then I added one final line. You assume too much for too long. I did not explain further, did not soften it, did not expand on it because it did not require anything else. I pressed send and placed the phone back down on the table, the screen going dark almost immediately, and I felt no release, no relief, just confirmation, not of what I had done, but of what I no longer needed to do. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly under the fading light, the ship continuing forward without pause, and I stood there for a moment longer, not waiting for a reply, not expecting one, just present in the quiet certainty that the distance between us had finally taken its true form, not measured in miles, but in understanding that would not be reversed. The reply came the next morning, not immediately, not in the way it used to when Daniel expected things to move at his pace, but slower, measured, as if he had taken time to consider his words more carefully than before. And when I turned my phone on and saw his name at the top of the screen again, I did not feel tension, I did not feel anticipation. I only felt a quiet curiosity about how he would choose to respond now that the situation had moved beyond his control. I opened the message and read it once, then again, not because it was complex, but because it was different. I did not realize you felt this way, it said, followed by, I thought I was helping. And I sat with that for a moment, not reacting, not correcting, just observing the shift. It was not an apology, not fully, but it was no longer a command, no longer an attempt to redefine what had already been decided. It was something else, something closer to recognition, even if incomplete. I placed the phone down beside me and looked out through the window. The ocean stretched wide and uninterrupted, the morning light softer than the days before, and I let the message settle without rushing to respond, because for the first time, I understood that I did not need to shape his understanding for him, that whatever realization he reached would have to come on its own, separate from my explanations, separate from my choices. Later that morning I joined Eleanor on the upper deck again, the air warm, the sky clear, and we sat in the same quiet way we had before, not asking for details, not offering unnecessary commentary, just sharing the space without expectation. Did they finally understand? She asked after a while, her eyes still on the horizon, and I considered the question carefully before answering. They are beginning to, I said, and even as I spoke the words, I knew that understanding was not something I could measure for them, only something I could recognize in its absence. She nodded slightly, as if that was enough, as if the process itself mattered more than the result, and we sat there a little longer, the ship moving forward with the same steady rhythm that had become familiar now, constant, reliable, not needing adjustment. When I returned to my room, I picked up my phone again, not out of habit but with intention, and I opened the message thread once more, reading his words again, not for meaning but for tone, for what had shifted between the lines, and then I typed slowly, deliberately, not to correct him, not to explain everything he had missed, but to establish something clear, something that did not depend on whether he agreed or not. You were helping the version of me you believed I was, I wrote, pausing briefly before continuing. I am not that version anymore. I read it once, the words simple, direct, without accusation, without softness, just accurate, and I pressed send without hesitation, placing the phone back down beside me as the screen dimmed again. There was no need to wait for a reply. No need to anticipate how he would respond to this version of me that he had not fully seen before, because whether he accepted it or not did not change its existence. I stood and walked to the balcony, the air warmer now, the sun higher, the ocean reflecting light in a way that made it impossible to look at directly for too long, and I rested my hands on the railing once more, the position familiar, the movement natural, not something I thought about anymore, just something I did. And as I stood there, looking out at the horizon that no longer felt distant but expansive, I understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken aloud, that this was not about distance from him, or from the life I had left behind. It was about alignment with myself, about stepping into something that had always been there but had been set aside for too long. And now that I had chosen it, fully, completely, there was no version of the past that could pull me back into a shape that no longer fit. The ship continued forward, steady and uninterrupted, and I remained exactly where I was, not searching, not waiting, just present in the quiet certainty that I had not lost anything that was truly mine, only what I had allowed others to believe was theirs.